The Making of an Elizabethan Mind, a Classical Curriculum. Lecture 7, Cicero, the Letters, and the Republic Dying. Before we go to the letters, I want to pick up something raised at the end of our last lecture, because it bears directly on how we should understand Shakespeare's use of his classical sources throughout this course. We spent considerable time on Mark Antony's funeral speech as a deployment of Ciceronian rhetoric. And it is that every structural element we identified as present and working. But there is a fact we should sit with. Speech as Shakespeare wrote it is almost entirely his own invention. The ancient sources, including Plutarch, from whom Shakespeare took the bones of the play, tell us only that Antony spoke at the funeral, that he read Caesar's will, that he displayed the body and the wounds, and that he praised Caesar. That is all. A few sentences of summary, no oration, no repeated refrain of honorable men, no pauses for the crowd's response, no controlled escalation from apparent moderation to barely contained fury, none of the machinery. Shakespeare looked at Plutarch's bare account and asked himself what a man of Antony's intelligence and ambition, trained in the same rhetorical tradition that Cicero had mastered, would have done with that moment. And then he wrote it. He did not find the speech in his sources. He understood his sources well enough to know what the sources had left out, and he supplied it from his own rhetorical education with such completeness that generations of readers have assumed they were reading history. This is what imitatio, fully achieved, actually looks like. Not imitation of a specific text, but the internalization of a tradition so deep that you can generate new instances of it indistinguishable from the originals. The grammar school had given Shakespeare the Ciceronian toolkit. He reached for it when the dramatic situation required it, and the result was a speech that Cicero himself, reading it, would have recognized as the work of someone who had done the reading. Whether the historical Antony was capable of anything like it is a different question. The historical Antony was capable of many things, some of them impressive and some of them catastrophic. And we will spend time with him when we reach Plutarch. But the orator of the forum, the man who turns a grieving crowd into an instrument of political violence in the space of 10 minutes, that man is Shakespeare's creation, which makes him, in a sense, the greatest product of the education this course is describing. Shakespeare learned the system well enough to produce a better example of it than history actually provided. Now, the letters. Cicero wrote letters throughout his adult life. He wrote to his brother Quintus, to his son Marcus, to various correspondents on matters of business and politics and philosophy. But the letters that matter most, the letters that constitute one of the great documents of Western literature, are the letters to Titus Pomponius Atticus, his closest friend, written over a period of roughly 30 years, from the late 60s before the Christian era to Cicero's death in 43. There are 426 of them. Atticus kept them, apparently with considerable care, and published them after Cicero's death, which tells us that Atticus understood what he had, and that the world was fortunate he did. Atticus is an interesting figure in his own right, and worth a moment's attention, because he is, in a way, the man Cicero could not quite bring himself to be. Atticus was wealthy, educated, of good family, and possessed of a political intelligence that expressed itself entirely as abstention. He refused office. He refused faction. He maintained friendships on both sides of every political divide, including the divide between Caesar and Pompey that destroyed everyone who chose a side. He lived to old age in considerable comfort and died of natural causes. His memoir, written by his friend, the biographer Cornelius Nepos, is almost startlingly serene for a man who lived through the civil wars, the dictatorship of Caesar, and the proscriptions of the triumvirate, in which hundreds of men of his class and acquaintance were killed. Atticus somehow was not one of them. He was, in short, the Burghley to Cicero's Essex, though both men would have found the comparison offensive for different reasons. And the correspondence between them is interesting, partly because Cicero is writing to a man whose fundamental political choice he could never endorse and could never quite stop envying. What makes the letters to Atticus extraordinary is their privacy. Cicero is not performing. He is thinking on the page, and the thinking is often contradictory, often anxious, occasionally petty, and shot through with moments of clarity and courage that are more impressive precisely because they are surrounded by so much ordinary human muddle. This is a man who could, in a public speech, sustain a position of absolute moral certainty for 2 hours. In his letters to Atticus, he changes his mind every third paragraph, reconsiders, changes it back, asks what he should do, and then tells Atticus not to answer that question because he has already decided, and then asks it again. He is, in other words, recognizably a human being, which is not always what you expect from the greatest orator of the ancient world. The crisis that runs through the later letters like a fault line waiting to split is the confrontation between Caesar and Pompey. Cicero had known both men for decades. He admired Caesar's abilities with a completeness that he found personally uncomfortable. He recognized in Caesar the same qualities of intelligence and rhetorical mastery that he valued most highly in himself, deployed with a strategic clarity that Cicero's more anxious temperament had never quite achieved. He also recognized, though he avoided saying it directly for as long as possible, that Caesar was going to win. The letters of the late 50s before the Christian era have the quality of a man watching a storm approach across an open plain, knowing there is no shelter, and continuing to describe the weather with great precision, because description is the only thing left. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon in January of 49 and the Civil War began in earnest, Cicero faced the choice that the later letters document with painful honesty which side to join. He had obligations to Pompey, who represented the constitutional order and the Senate and everything Cicero had devoted his career to defending. He had a kind of fascination with Caesar that was, as he admitted to Atticus, not entirely political in its nature, and he had a clear-eyed assessment of the military situation which told him that Pompey's cause was probably lost. He agonized. He wrote letters. He asked Atticus for advice and ignored it. He asked his son-in-law, Dolabella, for advice and ignored that too. He crossed the Adriatic to join Pompey's forces in Greece and immediately regretted it. There was a letter written from Pompey's camp at Dyrrhachium in 48, in which Cicero describes the atmosphere among Pompey's officers with a deadpan brevity that is one of the funniest and most despairing things in classical literature. He writes that the conversations in the camp are almost entirely devoted to what will be done to various people after the victory. Who will be given whose property? Who will be appointed to which office? Which of Caesar's supporters will be executed and which merely exiled? The victory, Cicero observes with a quietness that contains volumes, has not yet occurred. He does not say that it is not going to occur. It does not need to. Pompey was defeated at Pharsalus in August of 48 and killed shortly afterwards in Egypt. Caesar was merciful to most of his opponents, including Cicero. This mercy was, as Cicero understood, a political act as much as a personal one. Caesar's clemency was itself a demonstration of power. Man who chooses not to kill you is not necessarily your friend. He is demonstrating that the question of whether you live or die is his to decide. Cicero understood this completely and was grateful anyway, because the alternative was worse, and because the ability to understand a situation clearly and to feel what the situation makes you feel are not the same capacity and do not always operate simultaneously. He retired to his estates. He wrote Philosophy, the great series of philosophical works that he produced in the mid-40s before the Christian era, the De Finibus, the Tusculan Disputations, the De Natura Deorum, the Academics. These are works of genuine intellectual substance. Cicero's attempt to make Greek philosophy available in Latin, to provide the Roman-educated class with a philosophical vocabulary adequate to the situation they were in. They are also, unmistakably, the work of a man who is very busy, because if he stops being busy, he will have to think about what has happened to everything he cared about. Then Caesar was killed on the Ides of March in 44. Cicero, who had not been part of the conspiracy, heard the news and felt by his own account something close to joy. He wrote to his friend Cassius that the banquet had been splendid, but the wine had been poor, a witticism that was also, read carefully, a political assessment. The act was right. Casso. The aftermath was going to be difficult. He was correct about the aftermath. The conspirators had planned the assassination with considerable efficiency, and almost no thought about what came next. Antony, as Caesar's co-consul, was alive and in possession of Caesar's papers and Caesar's money, and crucially, Caesar's army's loyalty. The conspirators had no army and no clear program beyond the restoration of something they called liberty, which different members of the conspiracy defined in interestingly different ways. Within weeks, it was apparent that the political situation was at best unresolved and at worst already lost. Cicero responded with the most courageous and most reckless decision of his career. He chose to destroy Antony. He delivered between September of 44 and April of 43, 14 speeches attacking Antony with a ferocity and a personal venom that went beyond anything the political situation strictly required. He called them with a deliberate echo of the speeches against Catiline that had made his name the Philippics. The reference was to Demosthenes, the great Athenian orator who had tried to warn Athens against Philip of Macedon with a similar series of orations and with a similar lack of ultimate success. Cicero knew the precedent he was invoking. He invoked it anyway. The Philippics are magnificent. They are also, in their accumulated fury, something that looks from this distance rather like a man who has decided how he wants to end and is arranging the circumstances accordingly. When Octavian and Antony and Lepidus formed the triumvirate in October of 43 and began compiling the proscription lists, the list of men to be killed, Cicero's name was on them before the ink was dry. He attempted to flee. He was caught on the road to the coast, killed in his litter, and his head and hands sent to Rome. Antony had the head placed on the rostra, the exact same platform from which Cicero had delivered the Philippics, from which he had delivered the Catilinarian orations 30 years before. The rostra was Cicero's natural element, the place where he had been most fully himself, and Antony understood perfectly well what it meant to put Cicero's severed head there. It was a statement about what the rostra was now for, about who owned the Roman Forum, about what had happened to the kind of power that Cicero represented. The Elizabethan reader of the letters knew how the story ended before he read the first word. He knew because every educated person in Europe knew. Cicero's death was one of the fixed points of the Western imagination. The way that certain deaths are the ones that seem to mean something beyond themselves. And reading the letters with that knowledge, watching Cicero agonize and equivocate and occasionally transcend both, watching him make the choice that will kill him with open eyes and no very convincing alternative, the Elizabethan reader was not reading ancient history. He was reading a case study in what the political life of an intelligent man in a failing state actually costs. He was also, perhaps, making some private calculations about his own situation, the succession question, the Essex question, the question of what a good man does when the instruments of the Constitution are no longer functioning as they should. These were not abstract questions in the 1590s. They were, as we have observed before, something rather closer to professional development. In our next lecture, we move to Cicero, the rhetorician and theorist, the De Oratore, and what it says about the education of the complete public man. And then we will begin to close our account of Cicero with the Philippics themselves, and with the question of whether a man who knows he cannot win is more admirable or more foolish, for fighting anyway. It is, you will find, a question that does not get easier the more carefully you examine it. End of lecture 7.